The drawing room at Hartwood Park was entirely still. Margaret Thornleigh, Countess of Hartwood, sat alone at a small table set for two, dressed in the ivory gown she had worn to the Ashworth dinner in February, the best thing she owned that still fit the occasion. And at her throat, the pearls Charles had clasped there himself on the morning of their 5th anniversary, his hands warm and unhurried, his eyes on hers. That was a long time ago. The single candle on the table had burned down a 1/4 inch since she dismissed the servants at 7:30, and the small iced cake the kitchen had prepared sat untouched between 2 plates, one of which would remain untouched. Margaret was not weeping. She was not even, at this moment, particularly sad. She was sitting very straight in her chair with her wine glass in her hand, and on her face was an expression of someone who has just understood something that has been hovering at the edge of her vision for a very long time. Something patient and obvious and waiting to be seen. The clock on the mantelpiece read 20 minutes past 9. The door opened. Charles Thornleigh appeared in the doorway, still wearing his traveling coat, a small wrapped package pressed into his hand. She recognized the housekeeper's paper, the housekeeper's ribbon, and he stopped when he saw the table. He saw the cake. He saw the candle. He saw Margaret sitting alone in the room he had decorated for their wedding supper, at a table set for a dinner that had grown cold 2 hours ago, wearing the pearls he had given her in a different life. Something moved across his face. Recognition, or something close to it, arriving 23 years too late. Margaret looked at him. Then she lifted her glass in a small, civil, perfectly composed toast, to no one, to nothing, to the room itself. And she blew out the candle. The smoke curled upward in the dark. She set the glass down, placed her napkin beside her plate, and stood. She did not speak. She walked past him through the doorway without touching him, and she went upstairs, and she did not weep. That night, in her dressing room, Margaret sat at her writing desk and worked. She had been drafting an essay for 3 weeks, a piece about solitude and the habits women form to survive it. And in the particular clarity of that evening, she found she could see the end of it. She wrote until the candle guttered. By morning, she had completed the essay and sealed it for post, and she had written a second letter, this one to her grandmother's solicitor in London, requesting the keys and current condition of Linden Field, the dower cottage that had stood empty for 11 years. She had not asked for it before. She was asking now. She did not allow herself to think about the blanket of quiet that had settled over her marriage like snow settling over a garden, slowly, without drama, covering everything until the shapes beneath it were only suggestions of what they had been. She did not catalogue the dinners where Charles had spoken across her to his parliamentary colleagues, or the evenings she had spent reading alone while he worked in the library with the door closed, or the 6 previous birthdays she had navigated with diminishing ceremony and increasing self-sufficiency. She did not think about any of this because she had thought about it already, in the way one thinks about a thing for years before finally setting it down. She sealed the letter to the solicitor. She went to bed. She slept without difficulty, which surprised her and then did not. In the morning, the house was ordinary. Charles came down to breakfast, and Margaret poured his coffee, and they spoke briefly about a letter from Frederick at Cambridge and the likelihood of rain before Wednesday. She was courteous. She was warm, in the way that a hearth is warm when the fire has been banked low for the night. The heat still present, but contained, no longer throwing light. Charles looked at her twice across the table with an expression she recognized as the beginning of an apology. And she smiled and asked whether he had read the parliamentary report she had left on his desk. And he said he had not yet, and the moment passed. She had decided, the night of the birthday, that she would not perform anger. Anger would require that she still expected him to do better, and the particular quality of what she had felt, sitting alone at that table, was not anger at all. It was something quieter and more final. It was the recognition that she had been waiting, for a very long time, for a man to remember her, and that the waiting was now simply done. She had a life to get on with. She had essays to write. 2 mornings after the birthday, Charles came to her dressing room. He had spent 2 days attempting apologies. Formal ones at first, then less formal, then increasingly earnest. And Margaret had received each of them with the same unfailing courtesy and the same absolute distance, the way a very well-trained servant receives a message and gives nothing back. He knocked on the dressing room door, and she called him in, and he found her dressed for travel, her maid fastening the clasp on a small traveling case, 2 substantial trunks standing packed and waiting near the door. Her writing desk had been dismantled and wrapped in brown paper. Charles stood in the doorway and looked at the trunks. "Margaret," he said. "Good morning, Charles." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you angry with me?" Margaret turned from the looking-glass and considered him. "No," she said. "I am not angry." "You are leaving." "I am going to Linden Field, my grandmother's cottage. I have written to the solicitor and the keys were sent yesterday." She paused. "The house is in reasonable condition, apparently. It wants some work on the east-facing windows, but nothing urgent." "Are you leaving me?" Margaret set down the small bottle of scent she had been holding and looked at her husband with clear, steady eyes. He was 56 years old, and he looked it this morning. The lines at his eyes deeper than she remembered. Something worn and thin in his face that she had not noticed until this moment, because she had stopped looking at him as carefully as she once had, which was perhaps its own kind of answer. "You left first," she said. "Somewhere in the last 20 years, Charles. I couldn't tell you the exact date. I didn't notice it happening at the time, and I suspect you didn't either. But you went away from me, and I have been here keeping the chair warm, and I find that I am tired of it." He stood very still. She watched something move through him, not anger, not protest, but a kind of arrested recognition, the expression of a man who has just heard a sentence that rearranges something in him and knows, with certainty, that it will not rearrange back. "Linden Field is 12 miles, he said finally. "Yes. You intend to live there?" "I intend to find out what my life looks like when I am living it for myself," Margaret said. "I have not had a clear answer to that question in some time, and I would like one." Her maid closed the second trunk. The sound of the clasp was very distinct in the quiet room. Charles stood in the doorway as she gathered her gloves and her small leather writing case. He did not argue. He did not produce reasons or ledgers or the accumulated weight of 23 years. He simply stood there with his hands at his sides, and Margaret walked past him, and the Dowager Countess received notification by letter, and within the week Margaret was gone from Hartwood Park. Charles received nothing further. Linden Field sat at the edge of the village of Linden in a fold of early summer light. A modest stone cottage with low windows and a garden that had been running slightly wild for the better part of a decade. The roses had gone unpruned to the point of genuine ambition. The kitchen garden had reverted to a kind of cheerful disorder. The east-facing windows did want work, as the solicitor had said. But the parlor faced west, and in the evenings the light came through it warm and particular, and entirely unlike anything at Hartwood, where the rooms were designed for grandeur rather than comfort. Margaret unpacked her books first, then her writing desk. Then, after some consideration, the pearls, which she placed in a drawer and did not take out again for several weeks. She established a daily routine within the first fortnight. And the routine was the most radical thing she had done in 20 years. She wrote in the mornings, beginning at 7, before the day had accumulated its obligations. She walked the village lane in the afternoons, learning the names of the hedgerow plants she had always meant to identify, nodding to the postmistress and the baker's wife. She took her meals when she was hungry rather than when the dinner bell was rung. A freedom so simple, it embarrassed her slightly to realize how much it mattered. The friendship with Miss Poole began over a disputed volume of botanical illustrations at the village lending library. Margaret had reserved it. Miss Poole had apparently reserved it the same afternoon. And the librarian, a mild man of 50 named Mr. Hadwick, had been hoping neither party would notice. They noticed. Miss Poole was a schoolmistress of perhaps 40, sharp-minded and entirely unimpressed by a countess's precedence, and she made her case for the volume with a directness that Margaret found immediately refreshing. "I have been waiting 3 weeks for that book," Miss Poole said. Not unkindly, but without apology. "As have I," Margaret replied. "I have a particular interest in the section on late summer flowering plants. And I have 17 children who are going to identify every plant in the North Meadow by Friday, or I shall be very disappointed in them." Miss Poole paused. "We could share it." They shared it. They also shared, over the following weeks, a great deal of tea, a mutual impatience with vague thinking, and the particular ease that exists between two women who have each, for their own reasons, stopped performing contentment. Margaret's writing output in those weeks was the best she had produced in 3 years. The essays came out clean and direct, without the careful hedging she had always applied at Hartwood, where she wrote in stolen hours with one ear always turned toward the sound of the house. Here the house was hers, and the hours were hers, and the essays knew it. Charles began to write. The first letters were stiff and formal, the kind of letters written by a man who is attempting to appear composed while being neither. Then, incrementally, less formal. Then, by the 4th week, letters that attempted small questions: whether the cottage was comfortable, whether she had found a reliable woman for the kitchen, whether Frederick had written to her about his examinations. Margaret replied briefly, but she did reply. She gave him the facts he asked for and nothing more, and he wrote back with more questions, and she answered those too. Then Charles arrived. It was a Tuesday afternoon in heavy rain, 12 miles from Hartwood, and he had ridden it. He appeared at the cottage gate looking exactly like what he was. A man of 56 who had ridden 12 miles in the rain to stand outside a house he was not sure he would be invited into. He was wet through. His horse was being led to the stable by the cottage's old gardener, a man named Briggs, who had the expression of someone who had seen a great deal in his years and was reserving judgment. Margaret opened the door and looked at Charles. She looked at the rain. She looked at Charles again. "You are not coming in," she said. He answered quietly, "I understand. There is a covered porch on the east side." She went inside and returned 2 minutes later with a blanket, thick wool, dark green, unmistakably from Hartwood, because she had taken it from his dressing room the day she left without entirely knowing why. She walked to the porch and set it on the bench beside him. She did not hand it to him. She placed it where he could reach it, and she went back inside, and she sat in the parlor with the door open so she could hear if he spoke. He did not speak. He sat on the porch for an hour in the rain and then rode home. She watched him go from the window. She did not think about what it meant that she had watched. Charles came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. By the sixth visit, the rain had given way to early summer, and the village lane was dry and pleasant, and he had learned, slowly and with evident effort, to ask questions and wait for the full answer. He asked about Miss Poole, what she taught, what the village children were like, whether the botanical illustrations had been returned to the library. He asked about the garden and what Margaret intended to do about the roses. He asked what she was reading, and when she told him, he asked what the argument of the book was, and when she explained it, he did not offer a counter-argument or a correction. He simply sat with the answer, as though receiving it. On the sixth visit, they walked the lane together. The afternoon light was long and warm, and Charles had the look of a man who had not been sleeping well. The tired eyes, the slight heaviness in his step. He stumbled on a loose stone near the turning by the churchyard. Nothing dramatic, simply a man of 56 with tired eyes, not watching his footing carefully enough. And Margaret caught his elbow before she had thought about it. Her hand stayed a moment longer than the steadying required. She felt the wool of his coat under her palm, and the solidity of him, and something she did not name because she was not ready to name it. Neither of them remarked on it. They continued walking. The lane curved toward the village, and the light came through the elm trees in long horizontal bars. And by the time they turned back toward the cottage, they had spoken for 2 hours about things they had not spoken about in years. Then Henrietta arrived. Margaret's sister came unannounced on a Thursday morning, brisk and loyal and vibrating with a specific kind of fury that Margaret recognized from childhood as Henrietta at her most dangerous. She was 48 years old and had never married and had opinions about men that she had spent 48 years refining. And she had apparently been waiting for permission to deploy them about Charles Thornleigh specifically. 7 birthdays, Henrietta said, over the tea Margaret had poured with slightly resigned efficiency. 7, Margaret, I counted. I know how many it was, Henrietta. The third one I was here for. You told me he had been detained in London. I believed you because I chose to. She set her cup down. I should not have chosen to. It is done now, Margaret said. It is not done at all, Henrietta said. That is the point. They talked for 2 hours, and Margaret told her sister more of the truth than she had told anyone, because Henrietta was the one person who would not be shocked by it, and would not weep, and would not suggest that Margaret had somehow contributed to her own erasure by being too patient. Henrietta listened with her hands flat on the table and her jaw set, and when Margaret finished, Henrietta nodded once. Then, after a pause, Henrietta said, I have already sent him a letter. Margaret went very still. What letter? I wrote it last week. I have been keeping notes for some time. Dates, occasions, the birthday in the 3rd year when you waited until 10:30 before you ate alone. I posted it this morning before I came here. Henrietta had the expression of someone who knows they have done something irreversible and has decided to stand behind it anyway. He should know what he has done, in detail. Margaret stood up, put on her coat and walked to the village post office at a pace that surprised even Briggs the gardener, who watched her go from the kitchen garden with his hat in his hand. The letter had not yet been collected. The postmistress, who by this point had a warm regard for Margaret and a sound instinct for urgency, retrieved it from the outgoing box without requiring extensive explanation. Margaret thanked her, walked back to the cottage, and that night, in the parlor grate, burned it. Henrietta watched from the doorway. He deserves to know. Perhaps, Margaret said, but not from a list, not from you. She watched the paper catch and curl. Whatever Charles comes to understand about what he has done, it must come from his own seeing, or it means nothing. That same night, long after Henrietta had gone to bed in the spare room. Margaret came downstairs at 3 in the morning because she could not sleep, and the parlor fire would still have some warmth in it. Charles was in the chair. He had visited that afternoon. She remembered now that the storm had come in fast from the west, and the road back to Hartwood would have been impassable by evening. The housekeeper, a sensible woman named Mrs. Briggs, had apparently made up the chair with a cushion and a coverlet and let him sleep, and no one had thought to wake Margaret. He was deeply asleep, his head tipped slightly back, one hand open on his knee. The fire had burned low. The room was very quiet. Margaret stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she crossed to the second chair, took the spare blanket folded over the arm, and tucked it around him. She was careful not to wake him. Her hand rested briefly on his shoulder. She could feel the slow rise and fall of his breathing through the wool, steady and entirely unaware of her. She stood there in the dark with her hand on his shoulder for perhaps 10 seconds. Then she went back upstairs. He never knew. In the morning, he was gone before she rose, having left a single folded note on the writing table in the parlor. "I am sorry for the rain and for the inconvenience." She read it standing, still in her dressing gown, and set it down on the table and went to her desk and wrote for 4 hours without stopping. The essay she produced that morning was the sharpest thing she had written in 5 years. The following Sunday, Margaret attended morning service at Linden Parish for the first time. She had been in the village 6 weeks, and she was beginning to be known, greeted by name at the post office, nodded to by the verger, waved at by the baker's wife across the lane. She had a pew near the middle of the nave, a modest position that suited her perfectly. She arrived to find the Dowager Countess of Hartwood already seated in the family pew at the front of the church, in full dress, with the particular quality of stillness that indicated she had been waiting and had calculated exactly how long she was willing to wait. The Dowager was 71 years old, and had been managing situations of this kind since before Margaret was born. She had clearly determined that a church, in a village where Margaret was building her reputation, was a place where Margaret would be too genteel to refuse her. Margaret walked to the family pew and sat beside her without expression. The Dowager gave a small nod of satisfaction. They sat through the service in silence. When the time came for communion, Margaret rose and walked to the altar alone. She took communion, returned to her seat, and at the end of the service walked the full length of the aisle, past a nave of watching villagers, without once turning to acknowledge the woman who had positioned herself as her companion. She exchanged a word with the vicar at the door about the flower rota. She spoke to Miss Poole about Frederick's examinations. She walked home through the autumn-edged morning, and the county had seen all of it. 2 hours later, the Dowager arrived at the cottage. Margaret poured tea. The Dowager sat with the rigid composure of a woman who has never in her life permitted herself to be made uncomfortable, and was currently being made extremely uncomfortable. "You are making the family ridiculous," the Dowager said. "I don't believe I am," Margaret said pleasantly. "A countess living in a dower cottage. No staff, no position, no—" "I have staff," Margaret said. "Mrs. Briggs is excellent. I have a position, I am the Countess of Hartwood, and I live at Linden Field, and the village seems to have adjusted to the arrangement without difficulty." She poured the Dowager's tea. "I am no longer in the business of preserving family names that did not preserve me. I should have said so years ago. But I am saying it now, and I hope we understand each other." The Dowager opened her mouth. She closed it. Margaret watched with genuine interest as the most formidable woman she had known for 23 years found, for the first time in her formidable life, that she had nothing to say. The tea was drunk in a silence that was entirely Margaret's. Charles arrived 2 days later, summoned by his mother. Margaret could see it in his face the moment he came through the gate. The set of his jaw, the particular stiffness that meant he had been given instructions and was attempting to carry them out despite some private resistance. She let him inside. Because it was raining, and because she was, underneath everything, still a fair woman. He sat across from her at the parlor table and began to speak about the family's standing and the season and the necessity of... "Charles," Margaret said. He stopped. "If you have come as your mother's emissary, you should go. I had begun to think you were coming as yourself." She looked at him steadily. "Those are different things, and I can only have one of them in my house." He left. He did not argue. He simply rose, held her gaze for a long moment, and walked out. What followed was 18 days of silence. No visits. No letters. The longest quiet since she had arrived at Linden Field, and a different quality of quiet from the one she had known at Hartwood. This one had edges to it, something unresolved pressing at the walls of each morning. Then a letter arrived, unlike any he had previously sent. There were no apologies in it, no requests. Charles described the breakfast table at Hartwood, where his place was set each morning and where the chair across from him remained empty. He described the corridor on the first floor that he walked twice a day, past the door of her dressing room, which stood open now because there was no reason to close it. He wrote that he had been reading in the evenings, because he did not know what else to do with the hours, and that he had found on the parlor shelf 3 books he had not known she owned, and that reading them had been like meeting a person he had lived beside for 20 years without introduction. He did not ask her to come back. He simply told her what was true. Margaret read the letter twice. She wrote back. Their correspondence in those weeks was the deepest conversation of their marriage. Frederick came home from Cambridge briefly, tall and earnest, with his father's eyes and his mother's directness, and told Margaret, over dinner at the cottage, that his father had been writing to him differently. Not the usual letters, Frederick said, not the ones about estate business and my examinations, different ones, quieter. He paused. He asked me in the last one whether I thought you were well. What did you tell him? Margaret asked. I told him you seemed better than I had seen you in years, Frederick said. Which is true. He looked at her across the table with the particular candor of a 20-year-old who has not yet learned to soften his observations. You look like yourself, Mother. I didn't realize until now that you hadn't for a while. Margaret asked him to stay for dinner. He stayed 3 days. At the end of the 3 weeks, Margaret wrote Charles a second note, brief and direct. Come Tuesday. Bring nothing. Ask the questions you have never asked. He arrived empty-handed. She let him inside, fully inside, for the first time since the porch visits began. And he came into the parlor and sat across the table from her. And neither of them spoke for a long moment. The fire was lit. The lamp was low. Outside, the autumn evening was drawing in early, the way evenings do in October. The dark coming down, like something patient and sure. Charles looked at his hands on the table. Then he looked at Margaret. What have you been writing? He asked. It was the right question. They both felt the weight of how long it had taken to arrive, not in any dramatic way, but the way you feel the weight of a door that has been stuck for years and is finally opened. The simple fact of its moving more remarkable than the motion itself. Margaret reached to the side table and picked up a London periodical she had placed there that afternoon. She opened it to a marked passage and set it in front of him. Charles read. He read the whole essay, a piece about a woman who had learned, over many years, and then, in a sudden clear season, to celebrate her own existence without requiring a witness. He read it carefully, the way he had been learning to read things since the letters began, without looking up, without offering a response until he had finished. The name at the bottom was H.L. Farrow. He did not say anything about the pseudonym. He set the periodical down and looked at her. "How many essays are there?" he asked. 14, Margaret said. 3 periodicals, 4 years. Every payment saved. He absorbed this. She watched him absorb it. Not with the wounded expression of a man discovering he had been deceived, but with something more complicated, more honest. The expression of a man recognizing that the person sitting across from him had been living a life he had entirely failed to see. "I should have known," he said. "You should have looked," Margaret said without heat. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need to tell you about Lancashire." He told her everything. The failed mill investment, a decision he had made in the autumn of the year before last, well-researched and reasonable at the time, disastrously wrong in its outcome. 18 months of private financial reckoning, the careful management of accounts and creditors, and the daily calculation of what could be saved. He had told no one. He had told her nothing, every single morning choosing to carry it alone because he had decided, without asking her, that she could not bear it. "I thought I was protecting you," he said. "I know," Margaret said. "I understand now that I was not." He looked at her directly. "I forgot your birthdays, not because I stopped loving you. I forgot them because I stopped considering you capable of being hurt by me. Because I had decided you were steady and self-sufficient and did not require my attention in the same way the estate did. And I know tonight that the second thing is worse than the first." He paused. "I am not asking your forgiveness. I am asking whether I may continue coming to the cottage. Whether you will allow me to learn you, the person you actually are, not the one I invented for my own convenience." Margaret looked at him across the table. The lamp threw its warm light across his face, and she could see the tiredness in him, the genuine cost of the months just past. And beneath it, something that had not been there in years, or perhaps had been there always, and she had stopped looking for it, the same way he had stopped looking for her. "From this hour," she said, "we will either know each other completely or not at all. I will not go back to what we were. I won't manage your comfort and call it a marriage." She paused. "If you mean to come here, you come honestly. No shielding, no deciding for me what I can bear. No arriving as your mother's messenger or the estate's ambassador. You come as yourself, or you don't come." Charles held her gaze and said simply, "Yes." He did not negotiate. He did not qualify. He said it plainly, the way a man says a thing when he means it entirely. Neither of them slept that night. At dawn, Margaret walked Charles to the cottage gate. The garden was gray and still in the early light. The roses that Briggs had finally pruned back, standing in neat rows along the wall, the air carrying the particular cold clarity of an October morning. Charles had his coat and his hat, and the expression of a man who had just set something down that he had been carrying for a very long time. Margaret stopped him at the gate, with her hand on his sleeve. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Something I have not asked in 23 years of marriage." She looked at him steadily. "Do you know what I want most from my own life now?" He looked at her. Something moved through his face, not the automatic reassurance she had expected, not the comfortable assumption that he knew the answer. He thought about it, genuinely, the way she had watched him learn to think about things in the porch visits, in the letters, in the long evenings of correspondence. "No," he said, "but I would like to." Margaret kissed him. Once, slowly, at the gate in the early October light, with the frost still on the grass and the village beginning to wake somewhere beyond the lane. It was not a return to anything that had come before. It was a first time, entirely new, belonging to the two people they had finally become. Over the following 8 months, visits became real conversations, and real conversations became the texture of their days together. Charles came to Linden Field on Tuesdays and often on Thursdays, and then sometimes on Saturdays too. And Margaret read him passages from essays in progress, and he described, with increasing frankness, the actual shape of his days, the estate business, the parliamentary work, the quiet difficulty of managing Hartwood alone, which he was doing now with a different kind of attention than before. The Lancashire situation resolved in March, quietly. A London editor named Mr. Sayers, with whom Margaret had been corresponding for 3 years about her essays, knew a man in the city who had an interest in Northern Mill investments, and a letter of introduction passed through Margaret's hands in January, and arrived in the right place in February, and opened a financial door that had been closed for 18 months. Margaret did not announce this. She did not mention it to Charles at all. He found out in April, sorting through a small pile of correspondence on her writing desk while she was in the garden, looking for the letters she had mentioned from Miss Poole's school committee. He found instead a letter from Mr. Sayers that, when read carefully, connected a chain of events he had not seen. The introduction, the contact, the resolution that had arrived in his own affairs as though by luck, and that was, he now understood, not luck at all. He came to the garden with the letter in his hand. He stood in the doorway and looked at Margaret, who was examining the new growth on the pruned roses with Briggs. He did not make a speech. He did not declare anything. He simply stood there with the letter and the particular expression of a man whose understanding of the person he married has just shifted permanently and irrevocably. Margaret looked up and saw his face and read it precisely. She nodded once and went back to the roses. He stayed for dinner. He stayed that evening to help her carry the lamp upstairs, and the fire burned low in the parlor, and the cottage was entirely quiet. And the next image was the morning. Early light through the west-facing windows, 2 cups of tea on a single tray on the writing desk, and Margaret at her chair with a fresh page before her. Autumn came back to Linden Field with its particular generosity. The garden turning gold, the evenings closing in earlier, the parlor fire lit by 5 o'clock. Margaret's 52nd birthday fell on a Thursday in October, and she prepared for it with a quiet pleasure that had nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with choice. She had invited a small company. Henrietta arrived on the Wednesday and occupied the spare room with her customary efficiency and a bottle of excellent Madeira she had brought from London. Miss Poole came directly from the schoolhouse at 4, still carrying a volume of botanical illustrations she had been meaning to return for a fortnight. Frederick had ridden down from Cambridge for the occasion, arriving that morning with muddy boots and the particular brightness of a young man who was glad to be somewhere. The parish vicar, a gentleman named Mr. Alcott, who had been kind to Margaret from her first Sunday at Linden, came with his wife. Briggs, the gardener, and his wife, who had tended the cottage and its occupants through all the seasons of this past year, sat at the end of the table with the dignity of people who had earned their place there. Charles was among them. He had arrived in the afternoon, without ceremony, and taken his seat at the table as what he was, her chosen guest. Nothing more formal than that, and nothing less. The cake was iced. The candles were lit. The room was warm and full of voices and the particular laughter of people who have, between them, no performance to maintain. The front door opened without a knock. The Dowager Countess of Hartwood stood in the doorway in full county dress, the dark silk, the Thornleigh diamonds, the expression of a woman who has arrived to deliver a verdict. She surveyed the room. The schoolmistress, the gardener, the vicar, Frederick with his Cambridge untidiness, Henrietta with her Madeira, and Margaret at the head of her own table in the cottage she had made her home. "Margaret," the dowager said, "this has gone on long enough. The season begins in a fortnight. The family cannot sustain another winter of this arrangement. You will return to Hartwood." The room was very still. Charles stood up. He did not raise his voice. He stood at the table in his wife's parlor, in front of his son and his wife's sister and the schoolmistress and the gardener and the vicar and the vicar's wife. And he spoke to his mother with complete clarity. "I have spent 20 years living at the wrong address," he said. "That was my mistake, and I made it for a long time before I understood what I was doing. Hartwood will pass to Frederick when he is ready for it, and Frederick will manage it well." He paused. "Margaret and I will be living wherever Margaret chooses to live. That is the only arrangement I am prepared to discuss." The dowager's eyes moved to him, then to Margaret, then back. "Charles, Mother," he said, and the single word carried something in it that the dowager had not heard from him before, not defiance, not anger, but a settled certainty that had the quality of a door closing very firmly from the inside. He turned to Margaret. The room was entirely quiet. The candles burned. Henrietta had her hand over her mouth. Frederick was very still, watching his father with an expression of careful attention. "Will you permit me to stay?" Charles asked. He asked it plainly, in front of all of them, in front of his son and her sister and the village she had made her own. "Not at Hartwood. Here, wherever you are?" Margaret looked at him. She looked at him for a long moment, reading his face the way she had been learning to read it again these past months. The genuine openness of it, the absence of performance, the man who had finally arrived as himself. Then she picked up her glass. She turned to Henrietta, who was already pressing her lips together against a smile. She turned to Frederick, who raised his glass at once. She turned to Miss Poole, who lifted hers with a brisk nod of approval. She turned to Briggs and his wife, who raised their glasses with the warm dignity of people who had watched all of this from the beginning and were glad of its ending. She turned to Mr. Alcott and his wife. Finally, she turned to Charles. She lifted her glass to him, and then she leaned forward and blew out the candle. The room laughed and applauded. Real laughter, the kind that fills a small cottage parlor completely, the kind that has warmth in it and relief and the particular joy of a thing resolved. Henrietta laughed so hard she had to set her glass down. Frederick was on his feet. Even Briggs was grinning behind his hand. The Dowager Countess of Hartwood turned and walked out of the cottage without sitting down. The door closed behind her. No one at the table watched her go. In the morning, early light came through the west-facing windows of the cottage parlor and fell across Margaret's writing desk. The fire had been laid and lit by Mrs. Briggs before the house was properly awake. 2 cups of tea sat on a single tray at the corner of the desk, one of them already half drunk. Margaret sat in her chair with a fresh page before her. The pen was in her hand. Outside, the October garden was still, the roses pruned and quiet, the lane beyond the gate empty in the early hour. She wrote the heading of a new essay. Then, for the first time in 4 years of publication, she wrote the name she had always owned, Margaret Thornleigh, Linden Field. She dipped the pen and began.